One, two, three. Are we live?
Okay, uh we should be
We're
on.
live?
Yeah, now we are.
Okay. Hey guys, welcome to this debate. We're gonna have our two guests here, and we have a bunch of viewers over here. So our guests here today are going to be ManInTheWall and MetalPegasus. And who will be our moderators today? I don't know because nobody wanted to become a moderator, so for some stupid reason.
So
So who
you're gonna
wants to
be
be
the
a moderator?
moderator.
Say aye.
You're
Aye.
you're gonna be the moderator, Falcon, because
Aye.
Alright. Go on.
Okay. Me and Leftism today are going to be it.
Yes.
So
Okay.
introduce you guys. Introduce yourselves.
You
Man
go
the
first.
wall, you go first. Oh, never mind.
all right.
Metal
Yeah.
Pegasus, you go
So
first.
I'm MetalPegasus. Well, I'm a socialist. I live in the U.S. right now. I was born in China. Not much else to say.
So hi. My name is ManInTheWall. I'm a social democrat. On my YouTube channel, I go after historical revisionism, and I am both the one good social democrat in the tanky sphere, and I'm also the bane of tanky sphere, depending on who you ask. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
All right.
Okay. So I imagine we'll have a number of things to talk about.
Hold up.
So,
Is everyone muted that should be muted since this debate's about to start now? So everyone except the moderator should be muted.
I think everyone's
Yeah, we're
muted.
fine. Go on.
Okay, good. Let's start.
Okay. So, you're Chinese American, yes?
I would call myself Chinese. I just live in America. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, I had been told by people in the Discord server that we're in, and just people who wanted us to debate, that you're something of a dengist or a advocate for the system that we have in modern China. Is that true, or have I been misled?
Let me put it this way. The system of economics that currently exists in modern China, I believe, is the best historical outcome, given what both the party and what the people wanted, even though it is obviously not the only outcome. In the sense that, obviously China would have preferred a slightly different path, but given the constraints of international politics, it is the best path that, out of the given the constraints, that could have been chosen, and I'm fairly proud of what it has accomplished.
All right. Would you consider China socialist?
What I consider it what?
Would you consider China socialist?
Socialist.
Okay. China is building socialism. We're on the socialist road. Have we completed the socialist construction? No. But we are building our way to it.
I'm not entirely sure if I agree with that, because I feel like I feel like, I have many issues with the way Mao Zedong conducted a lot of things, from his from what he did to Tibet to a lot of the mistakes made in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But I can say that, if nothing else, I think that Mao was trying to build some kind of socialism, at least in the way that he saw it. But I don't really see modern China as leaning towards socialism. If anything, I think that the rise of Deng and the rise of people like Xi Jinping was a move away from it. It was a embrace of the global market and global capitalism, allowing things like foreign investment. I mean, why do you think that all of America's plastic junk is made in China? I mean, China is a major player in the world capitalist system. It emboldens it and empowers it in a lot of ways. It frequently supports.
Alright, one point at a time.
Wait, can I make my all my points, and then I'll have
No,
to respond
make
to
one
them?
point at a time.
Okay,
One
sure.
point at a time.
All right, sure. Go ahead.
Because if you make all your points at once, I might forget what one of your second or third point. Why
okay,
did you
sure.
make
okay.
Just go ahead and respond.
So what's your first point? So let's just, to be precise, what is your first point?
My first point is that I think that is that I don't think that China is building socialism. I feel like in the last 75 years, ever since the Chinese Revolution, they've moved away from socialism.
So when do you believe? Okay, so in your story, when did China start to deviate from socialism?
Well, I mean, you could question whether it was socialist to begin with, but I would say the main deviations probably came when Deng Xiaoping came into power, or at least the further deviations. We can argue whether or not Maoist China was socialist to begin with, but now it is so far from socialism that, at least in my opinion, I don't think anyone could call it anything even close to socialist now. At least under Mao, you can make a slim argument if you believe in Marxism Leninism, but like post Deng or sorry, post Mao, I don't think you can make that argument. I just don't think you could.
All right. I can answer your question shortly, but it would create more problems, or I can answer your question in a longer form that would try to explain our philosophical differences. Because
how about do it shortly?
How about you do it shortly? Because I was constrained as well.
All right. So yes, it is true that ever since Mao turned to the USA, the meeting with Nixon, the normalization of relations, the re-entry of China into the world, into the UN Security Council, that this essentially meant a re-normalization of China's relations with the West. And yes, in this process, this was a process of rebuilding and mutual compromise. Meaning, like, for example, Nelson Rockefeller wrote a very nice glowing obituary of Mao when he died in the New York Times, right? This, of course, was this is a quid pro quo between the capitalist sphere and China. However, it was done on the basis of China maintaining socialist rule. And Deng Xiaoping made this very clear. Not just, in what happened in 1989 on June 4th, but also earlier when he went after not only the Mao era left wing that was like he purged 300,000 left wingers from the party who believed that the Mao era policies were sacrosanct and couldn't be touched, but he also went after repeatedly during the 80s. If you read his speeches, right wing elements that were essentially wanting to break laws and sell on the international market in ways that the Chinese government was not prepared to accept. So, yes, there was a push to build a market economy, but it was built in a way in which China's government would control every step of the process, even with foreign investment. And China's government, run by the Chinese Communist Party, represents the Chinese people. And
you've made a lot of points.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, but that's essentially how I would try to open the things that you're trying to say.
All right. Okay. So here are my issues with that. First off, you kind of act as if the embrace of the United States and the embrace of global capitalism was the only path for China going forward, but that wasn't necessarily true. If someone else. Wait.
What alternative path do you believe was possible?
ManInTheWall, you can speak.
Wait, MetalPegasus. Oh wait, let him finish.
I didn't interrupt you when you were speaking.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so first off, the point about that wasn't the only option that they had. If when Mao died, someone else besides Deng had replaced them, they could have, for example, maintained or rebuilt their fractured relationship with the Soviet Union and reincorporated themselves into the broader communist sphere rather than just going at it on their own. If anything, that probably would have been more beneficial for, I guess, what you could consider socialism, at least more so socialism in the form of traditional Marxism-Leninism, in that, like, the two big communist powers being united would have posed a more significant threat to Western capitalism. And as far as the other stuff, so as far as the state manages foreign investment, well, okay, but I don't really see how that's that's still moving away towards socialism. Just because the government has influence doesn't mean that that's socialist. I mean, that's literally the socialism is when the government does stuff meme.
Okay, so there's two problems with that argument, and But let's start with the historical one. You said, why didn't we ally with the Soviet Union? Are you aware of what happened in 1969? Okay, well, actually, no, let's start back before then. Mao, despite his slight disagreements with Stalin over territorial issues like Mongolia, Manchuria, for the most part, Mao and Stalin had a nice working relationship, and you saw this in our cooperation during the war, despite the initial misgivings. When Stalin died and Khrushchev came to power, Mao made it very clear that he did not believe Khrushchev represented socialism. He represented a form of revisionism, just because of the way he attacked Stalin and because of his essentially mucking up of the Soviet economic system. He understood that by doing this, it would essentially create weaknesses in the Soviet economic system that capitalists could exploit. And he understood that the reason why this happened is because inside the Soviet Union was still the remnants of capitalist classes and capitalist thinking. So as a result, the Soviet Union's reply to this was to cancel all of their economic and technical assistance to China. And they pulled out all their experts. And this was in 1959 when this happened. So what this also meant was that China was no longer protected by the Soviet nuclear umbrella. This is why Mao, for example, was so confident in our war in 1950 against the Americans in Korea, because he understood we had the protection of the Soviet nuclear umbrella if anything really were to escalate. But now we didn't have that, so China was forced to develop our own nuclear weapon. We did this in 1964. We were the North Korea of the 1960s. We were diplomatically isolated from both superpowers. And you have to understand, ever since the Americans like to call this a draw, but technically they lost. Ever since their loss in Korea, they've been planning on nuking Chinese cities. They've been drawing up independent plans to nuke Chinese cities. And after China built our own nuke, the Soviets were planning on firing ICBMs at our cities as well. And in this process, the Soviet Union and America had a secret underground diplomatic relationship for joint attack on China. And we knew this, but we couldn't do much about it. As part of their plans, they planned on essentially launching a joint attack where the Red Army would create a provocation in northern China, the PLA would respond, and the Americans would follow up with their bombers. And that's what happened in 1969. This was part of the plan. However, China defeated them. We actually, not defeated, we at least inflicted sufficient casualties to the Red Army that they no longer wished to engage in this attack. However, the Americans had a backup plan for this diplomatically, the Soviets did not. The Americans decided they were going to use the Soviet attack on us as an excuse to pull China closer to the American sphere of influence, which is, how Kissinger secretly was visiting China, revealing CIA documents of how the Soviets were planning on nuking us, all of that, right? This was intended to build trust with China. But the thing is, the Soviets but we understood that if we turned down the American deal, it's very likely the Americans would go back to their original plan of a joint attack. This is why, from our point of view, we didn't really have much choice, because we understood that if we antagonized both superpowers, there could be a time where they could unite, they could jointly take us out. And that would be very dangerous. So we had to ally with one of the superpowers to ensure survival, because we were militarily the weaker party. And
okay, can I respond to this?
In that situation, since we had just fought the Soviets, it seems rational to support the Americans.
Yeah, you can.
Okay. So two things. One, by your logic, the conflict with the Soviet Union, if Mao Zedong had not been so hostile to, but by your own logic, or at least by ML logic, if Mao had not been so hostile to Khrushchev as to suspend relations and proclaim that he himself was and he only was the true leader of the communist world, then the conflicts between that forced China to make those that deal with America likely would not have happened. And also, as far as if you have to make peace with either the United States or the Soviet Union, even if you had fought a border conflict, it probably makes more sense. Again, by the ML logic, I feel weird in this debate because I'm basically using ML logic for most of my arguments, but I feel like they stand nonetheless. Wouldn't you want to make
MLM?
Wait, can I finish? Wouldn't you want to make the deal with the worker state that, while you may feel has been degenerated, is at the very least a worker state as opposed to just a state that's the outright bulwark and global representative of capitalism. Like, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a strategic and ideological perspective, you know?
Well,
okay, now you could say your point.
okay.
MetalPegasus.
Here's the part about ML logic or ML theory that that has always been okay. There's two things we have to separate here. First, obviously, as two of the first socialist states, both the Soviet Union and China did not create a functional international policy based off of actual socialist principles. Instead, we just inherited the geopolitics and thinking of the previous regimes. You know, the Chinese traditional idea that, you know, you should be harsh on your neighbors and be friendly to your countries further away. That's traditional Chinese understanding of geopolitics, right? And then, of course, the Soviet Union also inherited some of the ideas from the Tsarists, from Tsarist Russia. The idea, for example, that they had the legitimate right to meddle in the affairs of, let's say, Mongolia, or that they're, you know, despite, you know, Lenin agreed, for example, that the territories,
Wait, one at a time.
the territories of Vladivostok, you know, that whole area, it was actually taken unfairly from the Qing government, right? And the Qing, and you know, and he signed a deal with the nationalist government, with Lenin, that such an area would be returned to the nationalist government once the nationalist government actually will stabilize China. But of course, Lenin died, Stalin inherited the Soviet government, Mao brought this up once Mao united China, but nothing came of it, because by then, Vladivostok, in the context of the Cold War, had become such an important port for the Russian Far Eastern Fleet and for the Russian forces, especially in the context of the Korean War, that the Soviets had a good reason to rebuff that, and we, you know, with the deterioration of relations, things never got back to that point. Obviously, this is a failure of international diplomacy on if you care about building an international diplomatic system based off of socialist principles. But again, these both of us, our states, were formed rather early in the process, right? We were essentially pioneers. We were clearing out a new path of how socialism should work, both in the economic sphere as well as in military theory, and also in politics and international relations. And initially, we didn't do a good job because we were basing off of previous non-socialist models, because that's all we had. And to be fair, why did the Americans under NATO do better? Because the Americans had a much easier system. Because capitalism already has a system of subordination. It's called business. It's literally called essentially a mother company and a daughter company, right? You're just so what America did under NATO is America essentially was like the CEO of NATO, and America became the CEO of world capitalism after 1945. So it was much easier for them to take already existing business logic and apply it to international relations, and how America essentially subordinated Europe and Japan under its wing. This is why, you know, the capitalist world could, despite their internal inefficiencies, cooperate better on the international stage, but precisely because of this relation. And when the Soviet Union saw the creation of NATO, they created the Warsaw Pact. The problem was, the Warsaw Pact, especially under Khrushchev, began to be managed by the same way the Americans were, because the Soviets didn't quite know how else to manage it. And because the modern theory of in Chinese we call this in other words, we call this in modern Chinese, in other words, the diplomatic, think of the diplomatic ideas behind One Belt, One Road that Xi Jinping is creating. The idea of no matter how big of a nation you are, no matter what you produce, we're all equals when it comes to on the table of international diplomacy, right? That idea was, I mean, I'm sure there were socialists who had that idea, you know, since 1920s, but for that idea to be taken up at a state level, to be advanced at a state level, requires a more mature understanding of international politics that wasn't there at the time. Do you understand? It's like, we can criticize our ancestors for the mistakes, for the things they didn't do, but in many cases they didn't have an idea how to do this. So, and initially there wasn't that idea of how to do this, which is why when Mao criticized the Warsaw Pact and criticized the way the Soviet Union was micromanaging it, because it was very much like the way the Americans were micromanaging it, Mao had a point. But the problem was, we couldn't really provide a better alternative either that was credible, because at the time, China's economic, diplomatic, and military power was too weak. We couldn't really influence that system. Which is why...
Okay,
and again, you're taking what you're saying. What about ML theory? Why didn't you do it this way? Here's the problem. Like I said, there's constraints here. If you're going to say, you could say, but why did you antagonize Khrushchev that bad? Why didn't you just be more conciliatory? Here's the problem. China built ourselves, modern China, communist China, we built ourselves on not being conciliatory to foreign powers, because the history of China for the last 100 years was repeated humiliation by larger powers, no matter in what name they came, right? They came first in the name of religion and profits, then they came in the name of imperialism and white supremacy. They came in all kinds of names. But we certainly were not going to accept a repeat of that history under the name of socialism. Understand? That was not going to be acceptable to the Chinese people, not to Mao, not to any of his generals, and not to any of the people in the intelligentsia of the Chinese Communist Party. That just was not going to happen. So when Khrushchev was saying things like, let's build a joint Far Eastern Navy, but, we had no shipyards at the time. It would have just been the Soviet Navy being stationed at a Chinese port. Of course, the Soviets had a good military reason for this, because they needed to have a warm water port, and Vladivostok wasn't the best. But to do this at the time when China's, given the intellectual climate in China, that's not something that could have worked. Do you understand? If China's Communist Party agreed to that, we would have actually lost the faith of the Chinese.
Let him finish his point.
Now I'm done.
All right.
Okay,
let me respond to this. So first off, I understand that China's desire for to not be subservient to foreign powers is something that definitely influenced their decision to split off from the Soviet Union. But just because I can understand something doesn't mean that at least from like an ML perspective, it's good. It was still an incredibly silly move that split the communist world in two and made them weaker in the face of global capitalism. And also, I don't think it's fair to say that I don't think the Soviets necessarily wanted to dominate China in the same way that they wanted to dominate the Warsaw Pact. It didn't seem like when Stalin and Mao were around, it didn't seem like Stalin really dominated.
Stalin certainly did not, and Stalin did not try to dominate either the Warsaw Pact nor China. But Khrushchev did.
One at a time.
Okay.
Point.
Okay. How so? I mean, that's the only thing that you brought up is like them using a joint navy. And even if, it wasn't like Mao had to agree to have like Soviet soldiers stationed in China or anything.
Oh, no. This was the original Soviet intent during the Korean War. The original idea was that the Soviet Union, when they saw the UN armies led by the US disrupting the Koreans, the Soviet original proposal was, okay, what's the problem? We'll just put some Red Army soldiers in Manchuria. And Mao harshly shot that down. And it was after that the Soviets were like, okay, since you don't want us to put soldiers in Manchuria, we can't do anything. That's when we had to send in the PLA. So this tension always was there.
Sure, it was always there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, again, from an ML perspective, and again, I should clarify, I'm not an ML. That doesn't mean it makes rational sense to completely break off relationships with the Soviet Union when, even if you don't always see eye to eye, certainly China was closer to the Soviet Union than it was to, like, America. It's just like I can understand the decision from a historical context. I get that there were differences, but I'm just saying from like a logical perspective, from an ML perspective, it makes more sense for the Soviets and Chinese to work out their differences than it does for them to completely split apart. And maybe if they hadn't, I don't think they would have won the Cold War, but it would have made it easier, I would say.
No, I think we would have won the Cold War. But more specifically, I would say this. Mao and Stalin, despite their differences, did not escalate the underlying potential conflicts into an all-out denunciation and war. That was because Khrushchev came to power, and critically because it was Khrushchev came to power. Why? Because Khrushchev denounced Stalin.
Let him finish his point.
Okay, I'm done. Go on.
Okay, but the Sino-Soviet War happened under Brezhnev. Like this policy. This policy continued under Brezhnev, under Andropov, under whoever the other guy's name was. under Gorbachev. I mean, this continued like pretty consistently. If they just had an issue with Khrushchev, that'd be one thing. But Khrushchev was gone by that time. He was dead, I think. You know, I mean, with Brezhnev around, who was much more returned to like the old style, sort of not Stalinist per se, but more sort of like the old school kind of traditionalist conservative communism. I mean, why didn't they try to mend their relationship then? If the problem was just Khrushchev, then well, when Khrushchev's gone, then why does that matter?
Because what Mao saw with the existence of the bureaucratic, nomenclatura that pushed Khrushchev into power wasn't just Khrushchev. It was emblematic of an entire problem fermenting in Soviet society, where essentially they hadn't yet fully dealt with the ramifications of social class. In particular, there were elements of the old petty bourgeoisie that still had power in Soviet society. They still had influence in the party culturally, even when economically their basis has been wiped out. And this is why Mao was so insistent on creating a cultural revolution in China to make sure this didn't happen to China's party. And when he saw that when Brezhnev came to power, it was still the same social elements pushing him up. Even if the Soviet economy would try to go back to the old Stalin method of doing things, the social class composition was still dangerous, and that the social class composition was still necessary to be criticized. And that's why, our policy did not change, despite the fact that Khrushchev was kicked out of power in '64.
All right. So from an ML perspective, I mean, obviously you can still criticize like the Soviet power and the way that the system exists, but like again, would you rather ally yourself with a degenerated worker state or the West? At least, like again, from ML logic. And also the other thing is that like you could very much argue. Wait, can I finish? Is it still very much argue is that like you mentioned that kind of clique sort of structure existed under Mao. It definitely existed after Mao with Deng and shit, and especially nowadays with like the party clique and the way that almost the party had become a sort of new ruling class, both in the Soviet Union and China. And even Mao himself definitely, with his inner circle, definitely contributed to that in his own way.
Okay. Have you read what Mao said about Khrushchev, about what created the party cliques? The problem wasn't necessarily that there were people who disagreed with each other in the party. It was that these people who had formed that clique disagreed with the fundamental economic conception of socialism in general. That was the problem. If you have a clique in the party, but they all support socialism, that's fine. The problem is that, if you have a clique in the party that does not support socialism and is openly, essentially, tinkering with or overly politicizing the economic basis of the Soviet Union to the point where whether or not something functions is dependent on politics rather than on competence or economic performance or efficiency or doing the job that the people want, right? Which is what happened under Khrushchev, which also continued under Brezhnev. That is what's dangerous to socialism, because then the system isn't actually getting built. Instead, if somebody is not doing anything, or worse, they're stealing money from the people, but they're loyalists of the existing government, they'll get a free pass. And the thing is, this is a problem, I guess, of bureaucratic systems in general. However, the fact is, you still have to solve it. And the fact is, there is still a social class relation of why this happens. It's not because some people get automatically corrupt because they have power. No, it's because starting with the coalition that formed the Bolshevik Party to begin with, and then the way it was carried forward through the Stalin years, and just like it was never properly dealt with in the party or in society as a whole. So, these people on average having higher levels of education, on average having higher levels of status within the party, were able to manipulate their positions to essentially create more people like themselves. And that's what happened. Okay. And I was like, this is dangerous, and this reflects petty bourgeois thinking in the culture, in the superstructure, even when much of their economic base had already been removed. So which is why they had to be dealt with by the party and also by the people, not just by the party. It had to be dealt with by the people as well, as in the people had to reject this kind of thinking outright. Because if it was just the party, if it was just an administrative action, it would not work. This is why Mao created the Cultural Revolution to begin with. Of course, there were excesses, things went too far, there were some things that were completely not fitting the material conditions at the time of China, but that was the motivation behind it, especially after the failure of the Great Leap Forward. That's why Mao essentially took some of the economic ideas of the Great Leap Forward and mixed it with more popular management, which is what the Cultural Revolution was.
Okay, here's the thing. When it comes to like party cliques and all this stuff, I actually completely agree with you.
Wait. Did you finish your point?
Yes, I did.
MetalPegasus?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good.
Yes, I did.
Now you
Thing
can
is,
start talking.
Like I said, I'm a social democrat. I think that this is one of the big problems with like Marxism, Leninism, and the idea of creating a vanguard in general. What I'm more saying is that, like, while I agree with all of your critiques, and basically everything you just said, what I was saying was that, like, from an ML perspective, you'd still probably rather want to ally with that than you would with like global capitalism. But if we can get away from that for a little bit, because I kind of feel like we're arguing in circles a bit. My main issue is that, like, even if that's your concern, and that is a legitimate concern, that didn't really change when Mao died. Like with the Deng Xiaoping era and now into like modern China, if anything, the issue of like party cliques and sort of the party becoming the new ruling class, it's become even worse, especially now that there's more capital in the country, and now state-owned businesses basically function like the same way as like any other capital.
So your argument, if I were to sum it up in 2 words, that China is state capitalist, is that what you're saying?
I couldn't hear what you were saying. Mind if I finish my point here?
Do you believe China is state capitalist? Is that what you're trying to say?
Finish this point, sorry.
I do believe that China is state capitalist. I also believe that, like, under Mao it was state capitalist, but now it is much more state capitalist.
Okay. All right.
Weird.
So let me explode your second point first about ML logic. First of all, you have to understand something about Marx. In other words, why did Lenin create his theory to begin with? Because it was a problem in traditional Marxism, namely the stages conception of history, that said, if the country is not yet capitalist, they have to be capitalist first, and then they can become socialist. The problem was, if you did that, the majority of the Russian people would have died already in the process, or they would undergo through far more horrors than if you had just built the socialist state immediately. Especially, at the end of World War I, where Russia was the weakest link on the world capitalist supply chain, and any revolution there would have been a left-wing revolution. Lenin decided to go for the Maximal program, and was this a deviation from socialism as it was understood by Karl Kautsky in the Second International? Sure. But the thing is, socialism calls ourselves scientific. Marxism calls ourselves scientific socialism. Why? Because we are capable of changing our theory to match real conditions. And that's what, like a scientist, testing his newest theory against nature sees more and more nuance. It's the same thing. So when Lenin did that, it was a revision on Marx, but it was a necessary one to fit modern conditions. And what I'm saying is that if the traditional theory says, oh, we should have solidarity with all other socialist states, but we are in an effective position where, one socialist state is clearly much bigger and stronger than the other, and is currently led by somebody who is not very friendly towards the other socialist state. Well, what can you do? Theory says one thing, but if you were a member of the weaker state and you were to actually follow what theory says in practice, you would actually end up in a much worse position than if you maintained your own independence. So yes, in theory, we should have united. But if the fact that we did not, it's one of those geopolitical constraints I was talking about earlier. It is not a question of, in an ideal world, should we have done this? Because the answer is clearly no. The question is, given that such a thing had happened, what is China's response? And the only legitimate response is to essentially break off from what traditional theory says and essentially match it and create a new theory that matches new conditions, just like in any other physical science.
Okay, so
let me finish something else. And you're talking about how the party's an even bigger ruling class under Deng. And that it's more, and ever since it's been more and more of a out of control bureaucracy that essentially is running a state capitalist system. Okay.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about that. So now we're talking about modern China. We're no longer in the Maoist era. So we have to understand that the policy taken by the party was an evolving approach to a capitalist system that initially many of them did not really understand. Why? Because the theory of how capitalism works, as written not just by Marx, but also by Lenin, it's not that it's obsolete, it's not, but that capitalism, due to the way American unilateralism worked, but also the decline of American capitalism, with the neoliberal revolution and all that, it essentially created a unique period in capitalism where our traditional theory presupposed conditions that were more resembled World War I than the modern era. So we had to essentially recreate a modern Marxist theory that would describe the modern world of the actual capitalist system. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, there was in the time from 1945 to 75, in other words, the period before the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the period of the Bretton Woods system, America was essentially the world CEO of capitalism. It was the CEO of NATO, and it essentially coordinated the development of the entire Western capitalist world. Now, this collapsed because America, it collapsed due to a number of reasons, but one of them being the Vietnam War, but it collapsed. So as a result, America switched tactics, and they said, okay, so long as somewhere in the world markets are growing fast, so long as somewhere in the world GDP growth is high, then America will be able to profit, because they still kept dollar supremacy, even though they began to slowly disengage themselves from managing the economies. 什么？不行，我现在穿那么少，没办法。So they began to slowly disengage themselves from controlling the economies of, let's say, Germany or Japan, but they still controlled their foreign policy, right? This essentially because they understood they could no longer do so, as in such economies now in terms of not total industrial output, but in terms of high tech output, they were already in many areas exceeding America. So they couldn't control them anymore. So China was and of course this was part of the neoliberal revolution, right? Where America said free markets, no tariffs, no state-run industries, because this would allow Wall Street and it will allow the new dollar strategy to be able to essentially profit maximally off of the rest of the world. However, in this process, this weakened the institutions of the U.S. state and instead put more and more power in the hand, not in the hands of not just Wall Street, but also of international financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the BIS, and various export entities within the USA, right? But so this is the world that China entered in the 80s, and we had to essentially reconstruct Marxist theory to understand this world, because yes, you could try to understand it under the terms given by Lenin or Marx, but there would be some gaps, because those gaps just reflect modern changes. So in this process, the Chinese Communist Party changed our approach many times. Deng Xiaoping initially thought that he could essentially create a capitalist zone in the cities where there was just foreign trade, essentially trade hubs, and that there would be a socialist economic zone. That's what he initially thought. However, the capitalists in Hong Kong, in Singapore, the capitalists in the Western world working through Hong Kong and Singapore had a different idea. They're like, no, we want to have far deeper capital penetration. So, and then, when China clearly did not agree with this, they tried to create a color revolution on the 4th of June in 1989, what you know as the Tiananmen event, True. Right? And that was defeated. But because that was defeated, essentially I wouldn't say a struggle, but definitely a game of chess was starting to be played between, let's say, China and the West, right? The Soviet Union was collapsing. This was now obvious to everybody, including China. And they decided, and the West thought they could then, okay, if they can't win by color revolution, they're going to win by diplomatic pressure. They're going to win by economic pressure. They believed that China, being a poor, small country, and not small, but poor and small in terms of small, global power, poor in the sense that, at the time our GDP per capita was less than North Korea, that they believed such a country would inevitably succumb to market pressure. It would inevitably succumb to the demands of Western capital. It would inevitably become a liberal country like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, etc. That's what they assumed, because they assumed that just simply by the power of their money, they could mandate this. And also the next strategy in China's history was Jiang Zemin, right? And what he do? He says, okay, fine, we're gonna open up far more of the Chinese economy. We're gonna lay off the state-run sector because this is because Western capital wants that. However, we're gonna keep key sectors of the state economy going because, especially parts related to national defense, transportation, the core sectors that would essentially make the whole system work. Of course, finance would be included there too, right? Steelworks would be included in that too. So
going on for a really long time.
I'm going on because I'm trying to explain the history of what happened. Now, this approach didn't fully work. Okay, this approach worked in the sense that it created the material basis for the party to maintain itself despite the liberal onslaught from the West. Now, you could say, why do we do this? Why do we have to integrate to the West at all? Here's the problem. Like I already told you, because of the Soviet threat. But what kept us in this camp? Why couldn't we just, betray the West? Let's say, why didn't we just, after 1989, cancel all the contracts, renationalize everything? Why didn't we do that, right? There are people who ask this. And the problem was actually this, which is that we fought a war against Vietnam in the 80s, and we found very clearly the weaknesses in our military that, 20 years of not fighting. We won that war, but it was a hard war. There's repeated border skirmishes even after the official declaration of, Chinese withdrawal, right? And there was just all kinds of problems. And what we found was that, and then we saw what the Americans did to Iraq in the Gulf War. We saw that this was seriously dangerous in the sense that at the end of the Cold War, we did not have a military that was capable of resisting the Americans without using nuclear weapons. And if we did not build up our productive forces, we would turn into Yugoslavia. We would turn into Iraq, just a bigger version of it. But that's what would happen. As in, there would be future color revolutions possibly backed by US military forces. And if we did not defend ourselves, we would not be in a position to be able to actually fend them off. But how do we defend ourselves? We need to have advanced technologies. At the very least, for the military, if nothing else. And how do we get those advanced technologies? We need to build up more modern factories, more modern means of production. And who was the only one who had those technologies at the time? The Soviet Union was collapsing. The Soviet Union actually didn't have many of these technologies themselves. The only place we could have gotten them was from the West. So as much, and again, this is not something any socialist wants to do. Given a truly ideal world, none of us would have chosen this option. But if this is the only way to ensure survival, this is what we will do. We will learn from the West. We will take whatever technology is necessary. We will build up a modern, powerful China that at the very least can resist this kind of attack. And I have to understand another problem, ideological pressure. The Americans were doing the same thing to us they were doing to the Soviet Union. And there were tons of Chinese intellectuals in the 80s and 90s who, after going to the West became truly enamored of the liberal system. And we understood these kinds of people would only grow and grow, and the only way we could, and yeah, you could put them all in jail, send them all to re-education, you could do that. But the thing is, that's not why they are growing. They are growing because the material difference between between what we can produce and what they can produce is too high. The only way to be able to defeat this kind of trend, besides ideological education, is to create a system in which our ideological education can be believed. And how do we do that? Well, advance the productive forces to the point where their model no longer can no longer attract anyone, where their lies can no longer fool anyone, because you can look at modern China and say, we did better than you, or our system is at least as good as yours, so we don't need to go to America, we don't need to go to London, we don't have to go to Australia. And that's essentially what modern China did, and I don't see anything wrong with any of that. It secured the socialist system. It secured the future of the Chinese people. It made sure that we weren't under color revolution leadership. What's there not to like?
You said a lot of stuff, and I need to respond to it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. So,
but this is just one continuous.
I'm going to go for a while too, because you went for a really long time.
Good.
Okay. So I'm skeptical of the idea that China would have ended up into like a Yugoslavia or Iraq style situation for several reasons. One is that China has nukes. Two is that China has the biggest population in the world. Three is that China is not like Yugoslavia and that it doesn't have. I mean, I guess there's Tibet and the Uyghurs, but it doesn't have like a million different ethnic groups who all want independence and was only really being held together by one guy. And if you remove that guy, it just all falls apart, which is what happened to Yugoslavia. I don't think the U.S. would ever really want to go to war with China, if only for the nukes, and also because a conflict that large and destructive, it would not be worth it for them. They would not want to chew their teeth out on something that destructive. They're more interested in fighting like little wars with countries with natural resources that they can exploit the shit out of, like Iraq and Afghanistan, or comparatively little wars, I should say. So I don't think China was ever really at risk of becoming like the U.S. Second, you sort of say how like Tiananmen Square was like a color revolution, but from everything that I've read about Tiananmen Square, it seems like it was the exact opposite. Many of the people who were there were like Mao-style socialists who wanted who were dissatisfied with the market reforms of Deng Xiaoping. A lot of them were in favor of a more liberal democratic system, but that is true. But they were not in favor of many of them were not in favor of like capitalism or market liberalization. In fact, a lot of them were criticizing the government for that very reason. I mean, there's a reason that all this stuff took place under someone like Deng Xiaoping, who was supposed to be, a reformer and shit. Three, even if you were to make the argument that China had to like modernize and militarize for the sake of its economy, that's done. That's happened. China has one of the biggest militaries on the planet. Not as big as the U.S. is, obviously, but it has global reach. It's starting to build modern military bases. There are Chinese troops in Djibouti and in Cambodia and Central Asia, and they have like battle cruisers out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and like the Solomon Islands. Wait, let me finish. So like they're done with that. They're an effective army. They could start moving away from this part and transitioning back into a more socialist leaning system, but they won't do that because this system has made an elite group of people, most of them tied to the Communist Party, a handful of billionaires and people who manage business and people who are at the top of the party. A sort of collective ruling class, if you will, who have made a lot of money on this. China has the second largest number of billionaires in the world who would like to keep this system because they make money off of that. And what is that if not capitalist, my friend?
Is there more?
There is not more. I said my piece. What's that? Wait. Harold Sullivan, can you mute that? Can you mute that? Because you're making static noises.
I'll mute him, don't worry.
Okay.
Because I'm technically a channel mod, I can do that. Alright.
Okay.
So... You're asking what's China. Okay, so you're asking roughly what's China's next step. We've already built a powerful modern military. We can already defend ourselves within the first island chain. For those of you who don't know, the first island chain is essentially the areas right outside of China's naval sea corridors, which include South China Sea, Taiwan, and essentially South Korea. We are capable of pretty much pounding the U.S. Air Force and Navy if they were to enter that area, if we really wanted to. That's true. The issue, if you're asking me, why don't we, focus more on peace or focus more on demilitarization, or essentially not putting such a heavy national defense focus. The thing is,
that heavy national defense focus, also scaling down the capitalist and market aspects of it, at least by an ML logic.
Okay, so let me continue about what's going on here. What China's plan is actually this. Well, as long as the U.S. empire and dollar supremacy still exists, China needs to continue to build. However, the next step is not a military step; it's an economic step. where China, through One Belt, One Road, through all of our trade links across the world, will just jointly drop the dollar. And that itself, by itself, will crush the US empire. Because if you're continuing to print dollars, but no one's using dollars for world trade anymore, all the dollars you print will then flood back into the US economy, causing hyperinflation. And no matter how strong the US military is, if you can't pay them, they're not going to fight. If they can't afford to buy gasoline, if they can't afford to buy shipping parts, they won't be able to fight, no matter how big the US military is, no matter how many bases they have, no matter how many bombers and carriers they have. And that's essentially China's plan. The next step is economic. And after that, will China rebuild a more modern socialist infrastructure, more modern socialist political system? I guess that's the future. I can't tell. But given the plans of what is being written by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, I have no reason to doubt that that won't be the case. In other words, I have every reason to expect that, the next 20 years will be building socialist consciousness, building socialist enterprises, but doing so with modern technology, doing so with big data, doing so with AI. And I don't mean using AI to replace workers. I mean using it to essentially make the planned economy not have any of the flaws of the 1960s in the Soviet Union. That is essentially China's future.
Okay, can I respond to these points?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so first off, with the belt, I mean, as far as the idea that we're gonna collapse the U.S. empire by creating the Belt and Road, I don't know if that's necessarily true, because you can have a dominant military power that's not as much a dominant economic power, and I mean the U.S. still has the largest military in the world. Secondly, I don't think that I mean, okay, if we destroy the U.S. empire, great, but we're replacing the U.S. empire with another empire, which is the sort of because I mean, what the Chinese is doing in the Belt and Road Initiative, this is unquestionably economic imperialism. It's the exact same kind of shit that the U.S. pulls with the fucking IMF and the World Bank. As far as loaning out to countries, and it's a little bit different. Well, actually, no, it's very similar. I mean, what the IMF and World Bank does is that they go to developing countries, they give them loans in exchange for political favors. In this case, it's usually austerity. What China does is they go out, they go to developing countries, they give them loans, and exchange them on political favors, i.e., not recognizing Taiwan, being just generally politically and militarily aligned with China, the works. It's basically the same thing. It's really not all that different. So I don't really see I agree that the American economic empire is horrible, and a lot of the stuff that American companies and American business have done in the third world is indefensible. But I just feel like we're replacing one bad system with another. And then third, wait, can I make my third and final point?
Yeah, of course.
You've been going. Okay. My third point is that you seem to say oh well, after all of this is done, no, it's still socialism. I feel like I hear this a lot. They were always saying this in the Soviet Union. Oh, we'll just defeat the capitalists and then we'll build true socialism. Oh, we'll do this thing and that thing and then we'll build true socialism. It's always something there's always a bunch of hurdles that you need to get before it. And it's at a certain point, it's oh, you're the second largest economy in the world. You have one of the biggest GDPs in the world, one of the largest standing armies in the world. You're one of the most powerful nations on the planet, which is what China is right now. There's no reason that they couldn't make these steps to transition to stuff. Cuba is starting to do this. I have many issues with Cuba and the way that it's led, but it's starting to do the kind of economic measures that you would want in a socialist society, as far as that kind of thing. And Cuba is under an embargo by the United States and sits 90 miles from its coastline. If it's able to do that, there's no goddamn reason that China can't, except, of course, for the fact that there's a very powerful elite group of people in China, the billionaire class, the people who are influence them in the party, business managers, just generally what you can consider the Chinese big bourgeois, because they are bourgeois. There's no doubt about that, in both an economic sense and a political sense, who do not want this to happen because the market, the way that China has been running with its free markets, with its neoliberal exploitation via the Belt and Road Initiative, with its building up of its military, makes them a lot of money. And as I said previously, what is that if not capitalist?
Wait, you mean not socialist, right?
Not what? Oh, sorry. What if not socialist? My bad.
Oh god, that's
All
funny.
right.
Oh wow.
Yeah. All right. So, let's look at your examples one by one. First, you were talking about Belt and Road. Okay. The question to the people of, because obviously China is a bigger country than most of the other countries that we are signing bilateral trade agreements with, which is what Belt and Road is. For those countries, why would they sign Belt and Road besides the fact they have huge debts and they don't want to borrow from the IMF? Because they understand that if they sign with China, what will not happen is political interference. As in, let's say, like this happened in Malaysia, for example, right? There was a pro-Chinese, and also in Sri Lanka, right? There was a pro-Chinese leader that was signed the Belt and Road Initiative, and they elected someone who was anti-China and pro-US, and they, wanted to back out of / revise some of the conditions. When that was the case, China's government didn't send our special forces to coup them. We didn't put them on sanctions. We didn't do any of that. We just said, okay, if that's the case, we'll renegotiate. So
Okay.
if this is imperialism, it's not actually. If this is imperialism, it's not very effective at it. Now they're arguing, but this is capital export. But there's a problem here. In Lenin's work, when he defined imperialism, he said that imperialism was capital export. But there's one key thing that a lot of people forget, which is that for capital export to be imperialism, the country in question doing this has to be, capitalist to begin with, where the bourgeoisie rule the entire system. Or at least the bourgeoisie rule most of the system, especially the system's economy. But that's the next problem. I will address your state capitalist point right now. China is not state capitalist. Why? Because the large majority of China's businesses, the large portion of China's GDP's businesses are private. That's true, but there's an issue here. Private is in quotation marks. Why? Because a lot of these Chinese CEOs have direct connections to the party. Jack Ma is a party member, right? There's other people who might, be actually like relatives of party officials. You could say that's nepotism. You could say that's other problems. The thing is that the party can directly or indirectly control these companies. What do I mean by this? Let's say you are a tech company in China, like Tencent or Ali, right? Or Baidu. How did they get there? Initially, they were just a small startup, right? But what happened was this. Once they got past a certain size, the government pretty much, chose winners and losers in the market. They're like, okay, this company does well. Their leadership are people we trust, and they're willing to go along with government initiatives. We're going to promote you, right? And the case of Alibaba is very instructive. Ali was promoted in precisely this process, and then he became a celebrity in China. He became a celebrity out of China because he was publicly traded I believe, on the New York Stock Exchange, right? And he essentially began to express China's system in defense of China's system and modern worldview to Western audiences, and this is why he became popular in both. He had debates with Elon Musk, all of that, right? And then recently he was taken down. Why? Well, recently his company was taken down. Why? And he was not allowed to publish on social media anymore. Why? Because Jack Ma and his company openly defended the 996, 72 hours a week working system, which was apparently very common in the Chinese tech sector. By the way, this is illegal by Chinese law. You're not allowed to do that. And by openly defending it and calling the people who opposed it lazy and worthless trash, the typical classist garbage, the government went after him. They took his privileges away and started investigating his company for violations of monopoly. Right? What this tells you is that ultimately the power is not in the hands of any capitalist in China. It is in the hands of the party, and the party is not preferential to any capitalist clique. In other words, not preferential to any given capitalist individual, any capitalist company, or any clique of capitalists. It is. I'm not saying it is above them. It is more like it oversees them. Do you see? The Chinese party is capable of choosing who wins, who loses, and also, and if you don't follow party dictates, it doesn't matter how big you are right now. You could be the biggest life insurance company in China. You could be someone as big as Alibaba. You could be as big as Jack Ma. You're still gonna get kicked out because you have to follow the rules. That's just how our society works. It's not like the American society where corporations can like bribe like politicians to get things done. It doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. And so the kind of corruption that does exist in China is when state officials, with their nephew, their uncle, whatever, their children having a company essentially graft state funds to essentially give to their relatives to a dummy company that doesn't do anything. That's how real corruption happens in China. It's not the corporate gifting. It's more like openly looting the state coffers. That is what actually happens for the most part. And of course, this is illegal. And under Xi Jinping, this was attacked heavily. So many of the problems that you associate with, the Wenjia Baohu Jingtao period from 2000 to 2010, where corruption exploded, where the divide between rich and poor exploded, where all the clearly non-socialist things were happening in China, that stuff is getting cleaned up. I'm not saying that it's completely gone, because the social basis for it still exists. Correct, because there's the market economy, and the market economy generates capitalists, so that still exists. However, such people are not in charge of the society or of the party, and increasingly they're no longer in charge of public opinion either. So there is already a counterattack being held against them. It's just that, China is not ready to fully get rid of these people until the U.S. empire is gone, so there's no more foreign pressure, and until the political until like the latest technology is in place, so we can actually create a better system to replace the market system. Like, none of us think that the market system will be permanent. None of us want this to be permanent. None of us want to labor under 996 for the rest of our lives. No one actually wants this. No one. And like, China's I'm a child of the 90s, right? I was born in the 90s. Like, there are people born in the like China's Zoomers, right? The ones born in the 2000s. None of us actually want to live like this for another 40 years. None of us do. But the thing, and if you look at many of the strikes, many of the kids who are like openly like protesting against stuff, it's our generation, not the older one. But the thing is, we're doing this on behalf of socialism. Sometimes, we go a bit too far and the government censors us, but this doesn't make us go against the system. Why? Because we understand. Well, it's also the system that punishes these people, and actually, so in other words, there's a healthy relationship between the government and the people, and against the capitalists, and it's one in which I believe will continue. And as for, America can be a powerful military power without a powerful economy. No. The reason is this: because a modern war requires a modern industrial complex. And yes, the USA does have a military-industrial complex, but it requires a broader industrial complex in general. And due to deindustrialization in the US, which is, of course, finance capital, Wall Street, essentially taking all that money for themselves and not wanting to invest back in the US economy because it's no longer profitable to do so, the USA no longer has the ability to sustain a long-term war. Meaning, yes, the USA still has a big economy. Yes, the USA still has factories. And many of them are making like war machines. But it's in the long term not going to be able to wage a hard conflict with China. And if you collapse the US economy immediately thereafter, even what is left of the US industrial machine will be closed. So they cannot wage war.
Okay. So I have a question that I want to ask you, okay?
Oh, wait. One question. Do you guys want us, the moderators, to start asking questions now?
I think so, yeah.
How about after I'm done, we start doing that?
Okay, after you're done with this point, then we can start asking questions.
Of course.
Okay. Are you ready, Leftism, today?
Yeah. I'm ready for that. After I'm done responding to his points, then
now
we'll do that.
to your point. Now
okay.
do your response to rebuttal.
I have a question for you.
Uh-huh.
So, in 2008, after the global recession happened, much of it was caused by the misdeeds of many bankers in Iceland. When this was found out, Iceland prosecuted the bankers, the big powerful bankers who made the mistakes that helped lead to the Great Recession. They were punished for it. by this logic, is Iceland socialist?
No, because the means of production is still controlled by by the bourgeoisie in Iceland, by the landowners, and by the factories.
I mean, that's still largely the case in China. The only difference is that instead of the bourgeois acting independently, they act with the oversight of the state. But that's not really much of a meaningful distinction. Like you argue that.
Wait, one at a time. One at a time. Jeez. Sorry.
Okay, so you say that because China prosecutes its business people when they fuck up, that therefore means that China is socialist. So capitalist countries have done that. I mean, you have everything from the monopoly busting under from the Roosevelts to the thing I just mentioned with Iceland. It's not like under a capitalist system you can't still have issues where businessmen or powerful business people who commit corruption receive penalties for their actions. Now, it doesn't happen all that often, especially in the U.S., because capital influences political power. But just because that happens doesn't mean that it's socialist. As far as the other points too, you mentioned that the government sometimes censors people when they go too far out of line. I don't know about you, but as someone who considers themselves a libertarian leftist, I don't really like the idea of the government censoring people. I don't particularly like the idea of living in China and not being able to make memes about how Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh. I'm just not a big fan of that personally. I don't know. Maybe it's me. Okay, can I finish my other 2 points? The third point is that like you mentioned, when China doesn't overthrow governments when it doesn't like what they're doing. The only reason it doesn't do that is because it's not powerful enough to do that yet. Assuming that it becomes more powerful, I would bet every single dollar that I have that if they were in a more powerful state and they didn't have to worry about the U.S. as much, they would absolutely be cooing governments left and right who to agree with their economic principles. And the only reason that they don't is because they're not in the primary position of power. America is. As far as the point on military-industrial stuff, you're right. That was kind of dumb. But I stand by what I said as far as the fact we're really just destroying one economic and military empire and ultimately just going to replace it with another. And the last point was that like you said, was that you're arguing that you're basically, I feel like with this you're basically making the socialism is when the government does stuff meme. You're basically saying, well, because these corporations are owned by the state, that means that it's socialist. No, it doesn't. It's state capitalist, as in it's capitalist, but it's owned by the state. And that's not what socialism is, or at least not what it's supposed to be. Socialism is when the workers own the means of production, not when businesses are owned by the state. By that logic, you could probably remember a fascist government for socialist.
Wait, can I interject a little bit here?
Okay. Well, you're the mod. So if you're gonna attack me, then I'd recommend you don't.
Oh, I'm not gonna attack. I'm gonna say this as something as a mod that I want to say is this. Huawei, I think that's how you pronounce the company's name. Mm-hmm. It's basically worker owned. It has a co-op. They have a worker co-op. The founder and head of Huawei only owns 1% of the country, 1% of the company. That's what I want to say. I'm done now.
It's a cooperative that has a CEO. I'm not entirely sure if that's what a cooperative means.
So he only owns 1% of the company.
Okay, but he's still the guy in charge. He's still the one who's making the decision. It has a CEO. It has a CFO. I mean, it's basically
democracy in the workplace there.
What? You know what? Okay, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this again where I have a fight with the mod.
I'm not gonna fight with you. I'm not gonna fight with you. I'm just giving you. Oh yeah, I know. Okay. Now.
So when is it my turn to talk?
Yes, it's your turn now, MetalPegasus.
All right. So the argument. So where were we at? So the argument is socialism isn't when the government does stuff. Correct. It's more than that. But here's the thing. the biggest thing we have to understand, and I've said this before, but I'll emphasize it again. The socialism looks at the class character of the entire society, right? Both the means of production, meaning the factories, the workplaces, but also of the government itself. And if the class character of the government is socialist, then necessarily when it does things that are in favor of the working masses, it is helping advance socialism. Now, the reason why socialism is not when the government does stuff is in a social democracy, in a Western bourgeois democracy, is simple. Because under Western bourgeois democracy, the government by definition is the essentially the executive committee of the capitalist class. So of course, whenever it does stuff, it's not really doing socialism, and anyone who says that is just a libertarian idiot, right? But the thing is, that's only true under capitalist government. Now, of course, does this mean that anything that the Chinese government does is all socialist and that we can't criticize any of it because it's part of the necessary construction of the country? No, there's plenty of criticism in China. I will give you some examples. A lot of my friends on the left hate genetically modified crops because they understand this will destroy our national sovereignty in the sense that we will no longer be allowed to make our own crops. Instead, we'll be importing more stuff from America and from Monsanto. And there's a huge question about its safety. And China's Agricultural Bureau said this was okay. It greenlighted the process, and many of my friends have openly found evidence to the contrary, and they've publicized this online. Now, here's the thing: despite the fact they say this stuff, they're not censored. They're not told this is fake news. They're not told this is anti-scientific rumors for doing this because this is a legitimate debate to be had. So I'm not saying that. Do you see what I'm trying to say? There are people in China who have different views, and that's perfectly okay. As for the Winnie the Pooh thing, that's literally a meme on Reddit, and you have to understand why. Like literally, searching for it in China will not get you banned. Nothing will happen to you. What happened though was this: there was a Hong Kong freedom protester, in other words, essentially a separatist, who supported that stuff, and they posted Winnie the Pooh memes, and they got banned. Not because Winnie the Pooh is bad, not because it makes Xi Jinping look bad, but because the person doing this was a Hong Kong separatist. And of course, decide to make sympathy for themselves in the Western media. They created the fake news story that Winnie the Pooh was somehow banned in China. It wasn't. It was that they were banned in China, and they just equated the two because they wanted to make China look ridiculous to support their cause. That's how this happened. And this wasn't the recent Hong Kong protest. It was in the 2014 one. That's how this fake news meme got spread. Okay, and so in other words, the argument is that China is state capitalist. It is run by the party, and that the capitalists are essentially working through the party. If that's your argument, here's the problem though. If the capitalists are working with the party, that's true. Many capitalists do, but here's the problem: they are not the ones controlling the relationship. The party is. When a certain capitalist doesn't do what the state wants, they're gone. That tells you they're not in control. Strictly speaking, from a Marxist perspective, they are not the ruling class. Because you say, but what about the workers controlling the means of production? Well, here's the other thing. Okay, oh yeah, you said two things, right? Well, there's two things. First of all, if the workers and our rights are represented by the party, and the party is the vanguard party of the masses, then a state-run corporation is a worker-run corporation abstractly, the way, a representative democracy is just the abstraction of a direct democracy, because a direct democracy in many places is not practical, right? At least before the internet, right? And it's the same concept here, that if it's state-run, it is worker-run so long as the party running it, so long as the vanguard party running this state-run corporation is a party of the people. It is working for the interests of the working class, and there is nothing to say that the CCP is not. Second, can you guys hear me? Did I get blacked out?
Nah, you're good.
No,
Okay.
you're good.
Okay, good. The second thing is that, like I said, so this addresses China's state sector. What about China's private sector, where clearly violations of labor have been going on for 30 years, right? Where they were essentially overworking people, where they were lying about their work record, where there was the suicide nets, the horrible environmental crises, and often they were bribing local officials to look the other way. All of this stuff was happening since the 90s. I'm not going to pretend none of that happened. All of that did happen. However, and obviously the Chinese government in many cases did not do enough because many local officials were very corrupt. However, here was the thing. Whenever things did get to the hands of the central, in other words, when things did reach the attention of Beijing, every single time, every one of these corporations were harshly dealt with, fined, or if the workers killed like the CEO, the government looked the other way. They didn't care. What this tells you is that our attitude towards the private sector doing this stuff is incredibly harsh. It's more of, you guys are lucky you are allowed to exist at all. Behave yourselves or you'll be removed. Now you can say, what's the difference between the Chinese government doing this and the American or Icelandic or European Central Commission doing what they're doing? Simple. Because, let me put it this way. Would the USA go after Exxon, the US government? I mean, they did in the past, obviously. They went after the Rockefeller oil interests in 1914, but would they do it today? No. Would they legitimately go after Google would they they tried to, yeah, but only because of the fake news thing, right? But would they simply because Google was too big, break them up? Because they clearly are a monopoly.
That's a start, Can I respond to these points and then make my sort of make my closing statement?
Of course.
Okay,
but
thank you.
I didn't actually finish all of the things that you brought up.
Okay, go ahead with the others.
So, in other words, the USA wouldn't go after these top corporations even when they damage national interests, right? Because clearly, from the point of view of the US political system, which did not like Trump, Google, YouTube putting videos of Trump supporters up, giving them a platform was clearly not liked, right? But the thing was, they didn't shut down Google. Why? Because Google has so much clout within the bourgeoisie and within Congress that you can't do that to them. Do you see what I'm trying to say? They're already too big to fail. Just like in 2006, the banks were too big to fail, right? But the thing is, China does not act this way. Jack Ma has one of the biggest companies in China. He was up until a couple months ago was the pride of everybody. But after saying those completely anti-worker statements and not backing down, then what can we do to him? We have to investigate him for monopoly. We have to knock him down a couple pegs, right? China's biggest life insurance company, right? They were found guilty of essentially housing speculation. And essentially when Xi Jinping told the entire country to stop speculating on houses, these guys continued. So they were taken apart completely. It would be the equivalent of the US government taking apart Goldman Sachs or taking apart Citigroup. That would not happen in America, but this happens in China on a regular basis because these people are not integral to the state mechanism. They're not even, from the point of view of the communist system, from the socialist system, from the point of view of the Communist Party, they're not even integral to the economy in the sense that they can be replaced. They can all be replaced. This is something that the capitalist system cannot do. Okay, I am now done.
Okay. You made a lot of points there. So the main one that I want to focus on is the idea that it's not the same because because it's controlled by the state and the state is run by the vanguard, which is supposedly the vanguard of the Workers' Party. This gets at my issue with vanguard parties in general. My issue is that I think generally they tend to become super well, yeah, as time goes on, you've mentioned this rightly, they tend to become super fucking corrupt. We saw this in the Soviet Union, we saw this in China, and we saw this in plenty of other countries. Vanguard parties, especially ones that don't really have any meaningful opposition, at least how opposition is allowed to take place within the process, tend to become super corrupt and super non-responsive to the interests of the people. Now, obviously, that all happens in representative democracy too. But that still happens under China. So I don't think the argument that it's supposedly a vanguard movement is really all that relevant in this case. As far as the Winnie the Pooh stuff, I mean, they were banning the Hong Kong protesters, but again, that gets at my issue, which is that even Hong Kong separatists should have the right to, as long as they're not inciting violence or harassing people, they should have the right to say their piece on China's media platforms. They shouldn't just like wantonly ban them, especially given that it's controlled by the state. As far as I'm concerned, that's a violation of those Hong Kongers' civil liberties. Then, as far as the third point, as far as would America prosecute big tech? I mean, given the fact that one of the only things Republican and Democratic voters seem to generally agree on is that big tech sucks. I mean, I don't know. It seems plausible that like sometime in the near future we could see some prosecution for some major, maybe not full blown prosecution, but at the very least like the breaking up of some of these major tech firms. It's not likely, but it's plausible. And I mean, obviously, props to China for dismantling businesses when they do corrupt things, but doing that isn't socialism. I mean, again, the U.S. did this with its monopolies in the 1920s, and America wasn't a socialist country back then. Were there any other points? I don't think there were any other points. So I guess I'll just make my closing statement, and maybe then you make yours. So I've enjoyed this conversation for the most part. I think that it's interesting to talk about this very important issue of China, particularly in its modern day. I think that a lot of what you said is interesting, but if I'm being honest, there are arguments that I have heard before, and I feel like that I have decent responses to. But overall, I think you're intelligent, and I've enjoyed this debate for the most part, and I look forward to the two of us answering questions after this.
Wait. Okay. So, can hey, MetalPegasus, can you respond to what ManInTheWall's point, and then if you want to do your closing statement.
What point? Which one was he saying?
Oh, he was talking about China's censorship, and he was talking about the Hong Kong stuff.
Okay. All right. Let me just give a very pointed example for why so many people in China cannot stand the Hong Kong protesters. You have to understand two things. Yes, what a lot of the stuff they say is actually illegal in China. Like when you inciting separatism is illegal in China. Just like if you were to openly I will but let me give you an example for why so many of us from the mainland cannot tolerate what was going on there. Okay. In the Hong Kong airport, you had people flying in, right? And there would be a bunch of protesters not waving the Chinese flag, not even waving the Hong Kong flag, waving British and American flags, beating up anyone that looks non-white. Or essentially beating up anyone that looks Chinese, right? Whereas they would let white people pass. Let me give you an equivalent example. If you saw people in Honolulu asking for Hawaiian independence, and they weren't flying the old flag of Hawaii, they were flying the Russian and Chinese flag, and they were beating up white people and letting people like me pass in the airport, what would the average American think? The average American would think that this is a movement sponsored by foreign powers, right? No American would think this is a local movement. And that's exactly what we saw on our TVs. We saw people lighting people on fire. We saw people openly inciting violence. We saw people wearing masks. And then when you took their mask off, and this was before COVID, okay? When you took their mask off, they like started running away because they didn't want to be identified because they were actually officials in like the city government. You saw this stuff going on, right? You saw university professors and university presidents literally supporting the protests, in other words, allowing protesters to turn their university town into like essentially a barricaded fortress against the police, where they were essentially building Molotov cocktails. You saw this kind of stuff going on. And this is why people in the mainland like cheered when, and what we also saw was the corruption and the clear pro-British sentiment inside the Hong Kong city government and the municipality system and the court system, where protesters were being arrested, but they were, they went to jail and then they just went out like a week later because they were being arrested for a misdemeanor, even though, they were inciting other people to commit felonies, right? And this, now here's the thing: if what they were doing, if they were tried in Shenzhen, or if they were tried in Beijing, or they were tried in Guangzhou, they would be this is 5 to 10 years in jail, right? This is what was outraging the rest of us. Which is like, why is there some area of the country that has completely different laws, and not only completely different laws that are clearly like hurting other people from the mainland to the benefit of foreigners, right? This is what infuriated the rest of us. And I think if the equivalent thing was happening in the American South, where people were flying the flag of old Dixie and saying the South shall rise again, and like if you don't let us secede, if you don't let us pass our secession thing, we'll contact the Russian government or something. If you heard that, I think most Americans would understand there's something seriously wrong, and this isn't just a local movement, right? And that's what was going on in China. That's why all of us in the mainland wanted the government to take more decisive action than they actually did. China's action relatively in Hong Kong was much more restrained than what most of us wanted. But we understand why. There was public opinion pressure from the West. We couldn't do that. And that goes back to your point about, why doesn't China coup the government of Malaysia or Sri Lanka or Vietnam or any of these other countries to make them do what we want? Simple. We don't need to. As in, it's simple. The matter is not, because the USA is there and there would be negative pressure and all that. Because look, if we were really afraid of negative pressure, we wouldn't be talking openly about wanting to use the military to take over Taiwan, right? We're openly talking about this, and this is because this has more than like, and I would argue the majority of Chinese people actually support any means of unification with Taiwan, including military force, and this is openly being talked about. And if we were afraid of U.S. media pressure or the U.S. military, we wouldn't be talking about this. But then why does China not consider doing similar things to Malaysia or Singapore or Thailand or any of the other countries? Because we understand this has no benefit to us. As in, why these people, like, this is just a trade deal. This is just business. We don't need to getting ourselves this deeply involved benefits nobody. Not just because currently, the U.S. empire would love to create, a propaganda war. We were like, and obviously we're not going to give them a propaganda victory. Not just because of that, but because in the long term, like, it's just. Let me explain this way. Why would a Chinese soldier in the PLA? Yeah, obviously you should follow orders, but like, why would he? Why should he die? Why should he die for Chinese capital in Thailand? Or die for Chinese capital in Malaysia, right? That doesn't make sense. And no one, and like, this is something that you're not going to be able to convince anyone. And in other words, if the Chinese if the Communist Party did this, we would actually lose legitimacy. And that's why no one would do this, because it's literally a move that goes against our basic principles of, we were a nation that were bullied by other foreign imperial powers. They took away our country. They took away our money. They destroyed our future. They poisoned us with drugs. They interfered with our politics. So when we rise, we are not to do any of those things. We just because that would be a repudiation of what our ancestors fought for, right? And that propaganda is still very strong in China today. That sentiment is still very strong in China today, even especially among the military. So I don't think most Chinese people would actually support things like this. And that's why I don't think, if the US leaves the Pacific, all of a sudden China's going to start creating a new empire. No, we're not. This isn't the Han Dynasty. This isn't the Qing Dynasty. We're not thinking of like creating some ethno state or like this isn't the Japanese Empire. We're not like that. And why? Because we're not capitalist. And that's my closing statement. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. How about I've already made my closing statement. LT and Falcon, good general, you want to just ask us all some questions? I mean, would you like me to respond to what he said? Because I can't respond to it. Or would you like to just ask the questions? Guys?
No. We'll ask questions. LT, Leftism Today, do you want to ask a question? Leftism Today, are you there? Hello?
LT.
Come on. Wake up. Are you there? Hello?
Okay,
Maybe.
well, here I can briefly respond to what MetalPegasus said. So as far as like the Hong Kong stuff, you wanted them to like crack down even more. I mean, I do know that there were